my former boss, Nick Percoco. I worked with Nick for a number of years at TrustWave Spider Labs. We ran probably the largest global pen test and incident response team. Nick's moved on, I've moved on, but I always like to welcome Nick to tell us and grace us with what's going on in the industry. Mr. Percoco.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I've always been fascinated with new technology, particularly anything that enabled me to do more with less. Learning new ways, or even just get entertained. Technology experiences have guided my life in very interesting ways and have brought me to this very stage in which I speak to you today. When I was 4 years old, I traveled with my family down to Orlando, Florida. This was 1979. This was my first time on an airplane. It was also my first time on a train of any type, let alone something modern or futuristic. And it's also the first time I can specifically remember asking the question, how does this work? The experience I had almost 40 years ago has sparked a journey of curiosity that has lasted my entire lifetime. When I returned home to the Chicago suburbs, nothing seemed to be the same. My parents had to start watching my every move as I started pushing lots of buttons and pulling lots of levers and disconnecting things and trying to understand how things worked. I can remember being at a grocery store with my mom one day and standing in the checkout line, peering through the packs of gum and the candy bars, and I saw a red switch next to the checkout counter. I reached my hand through there and hit the button. It flipped off. Didn't think anything of it. Nothing seemed to change in my world, except for I started to hear voices saying, hey, wait a minute, my system's down. And then more voices. And it turned out that I actually flipped off all the checkout lines at the entire grocery store on a busy Saturday afternoon. There was also another case. Again, I was at a store with my mom. It was a health food store. And while she was talking and speaking with the clerk, I wandered into the back area. I remember peering up and seeing this giant vat of peanuts and what looked like a red robot below it where all these peanuts were flowing into. And there was a switch again. It looked like it was his ear. I braced myself up on a shelf and pushed his ear. And he roared into my excitement, started making these rumbling noises, and then started spewing peanut butter out of his mouth and all over the floor. I thought it was really exciting, but my mom nor the clerk thought it was very entertaining. I would spend hours sitting at home and tinkering with my father's television set. I used to change the dial, push the buttons, try to adjust things. It even escalated to a point where I started going behind the television set and even getting screwdrivers and taking off the back cover to try to learn how it worked. In the fall of 1981, my father came home from work one day and sat a large box down in front of the television. I can remember staring at that box with a lot of interest. You know, what's in that box? A lot of curiosity as I watched Tom and Jerry on the screen. My father walked up and he cleaned off some TV guides, old TV guides and some ashtrays from the top of that console television, and then reached out into the box and pulled out a machine that had some nice wood grain on the front of it, was made of metal and plastic, and had a cord tangling behind it. And he placed that box and that machine on top of the television set and pulled back the television, plugged the power adapter in, and then somehow out of thin air had a screwdriver up here. He always seemed to have a screwdriver sort of pulling out of thin air whenever he was around the house, and connected a wire to a machine that I would soon learn was called a VCR, or a video cassette recorder. Now the setup seemed to be complete. There's a television. It was tuned to channel 3, but then when we turned it on, it was just a bunch of static. Now, I used to actually spend hours watching static as a little bit of a strange child. To me, watching static was very similar to watching clouds on a nice summer day. You could sort of pick out various images and things that the static was forming. But this wasn't what this was all about. My father turned to me and said, hey, run upstairs and grab a small box off the kitchen table. I remember running up the stairs, grabbing this box, and it shook, literally strangely in my hand. It was a little bit of a rattle noise. And I remember running back down the stairs, leaping from the third to last step, and handing the box to my father. And as I did, I can see the letters VHS on that box. Now he pulled this black cartridge thing out of the sleeve, hit a button on top of the VCR, out popped a hatch. That was actually amusing in its own, and slid the cartridge in. Now he slid that cartridge in, locked into place, and then pushed a triangle button on the front of the screen. Now, the next 1 to 2 minutes seemed like an eternity, as I remember staring at my father, looking back at the screen, looking back at my father as there was just a black screen with some static on the top and on the bottom, and every once in a while there was like a little bit of a hint of a rainbow wave going across it. And we just sat there waiting for something to happen. Now, I can remember watching the screen and listening and hearing some drums, and then a fanfare, and then some words I couldn't read, and then a phrase as my father read to me aloud. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And then the word Star Wars. Now you might be, if you know your history well enough, you might be thinking, wait a minute, in 1981, Star Wars wasn't out on VHS. And you actually are right. But in my world, in my version of Star Wars, I remember seeing that scene when R2-D2 and C-3PO were in the desert. If you saw a shadow of a man walking across the screen, then you might know where this VHS tape came from. Now, in thinking of security and standards and their impacts on various industries, my mind kept drifting back to my first screening or my first experience in watching Star Wars. When I think about what I remember most about this movie, what always stands out is the attention to detail and the seemingly robust operations led by the Empire. It always raised questions in my mind. Who funds all this infrastructure? Where do the people come from? And how are they kept on task and on brand? Now, if you think about it this way, there must be some governing body within the Empire that actually creates all these standards for things like technology and manufacturing. When you look at the look and feel of the uniforms, the architecture and the construction of the facilities, and then even the computer interfaces and the fonts used on the various displays. So, okay, let's assume there's some governing body. They pull people together from all the far reaches of the galaxy, and they do a bunch of research. And they organize subject matter experts to do this research, and then they sit down with folks and they actually author standards. And they author an entire library of standards that gets distributed to every corner of the universe. Now, the whole purpose here is to ensure that everything is exactly as it should be. When you think about this, a galactic military complex such as the Empire surely would have very robust physical and technical security controls in place. This would include things like vulnerability assessments, red team exercises, robust procedures on how to monitor, identify intruders, how to triage those incidents, and how to escalate those incidents to get them resolved. But as we know, a small band of rebels first infiltrated the Death Star and escaped nearly unnoticed, and then about 2.5 weeks later shot a torpedo down an exhaust pipe and blew the entire thing up. So I kept thinking, well, how can this be possible? Now, wouldn't the Empire Standards Organization have a document on defending military complexes, an installation with detailed methods of how to defend against this type of attack? So I spent some time thinking about this in more detail and came up with 2 main reasons why this was possible. First, the various officers of the Empire are required to maintain compliance to a large library of standards 100% of the time. And then as an officer of the Empire, you actually never know when Darth Vader or the Emperor was going to actually pay you a visit to audit your operations. So then because of that, every visible aspect of your installation, of your operations, would need to be kept up to date and kept up to standards 100% of the time. Every visible aspect, because all the other areas would most likely not be inspected or not be able to be observed when they were being audited. Now, of course, the ramifications for some failure during that visual inspection is a little worse than a hand slap. It's not a fine. You don't get written up and you get an email sent to you that says you failed some audit. In this world, it's a forced choke in front of your peers and your subordinates. So now with all this focus on compliance within this world, within the Empire, when a Sith Lord pays a visit, much of the really important stuff, like being able to defend against an actual attack, like things that can be gleaned, are not things that can actually be gleaned from a conversation. They can't be read in policies and procedures, and they would most likely not be inspected by the auditor. So the second reason is that with all this attention, all this time that people are spending within the organization, the officers and their subordinates, it doesn't leave much time for things that matter in their world. Activities such as educating operations staff on actually how to identify intruders, training stormtroopers to increase their blaster accuracy, running X-wing attack simulations against the facilities to understand and mitigate weaknesses. And then finally, finding and password protecting industrial control systems such as those that control trash compactors and tractor beams. Now, in thinking about Star Wars and sort of relation to the world that we live in, the conclusion I came to is, as a leader of a security program, you must work hard to strike a balance between true security and compliance, or you can easily suffer the fate of the Death Star. Now, back in early 2003, I was brought on to join a new startup. At the time, the company was called TrustWave, and I was actually their 6th employee. I was brought on to be their first technical hire, to do consulting engagements, to do other activities, but I was also brought on to be their very first sales rep. I'd never been in sales before, and in fact, this was never something I had ever done before at all. But I started to make the rounds around the Chicago area, introducing myself, introducing my new company, and also introducing the products and the services that we had to offer. Historically, I'd always been the real deep technical person within this realm. I was always brought in by a sales rep to maybe do a demo of a product or to validate the company's technical expertise. But for about 3 weeks, I made my way around the Chicago area, going on 2 to 3 sales calls a day, trying to drum up a business for this 2-month-old company that I had just been hired on to help start up. Now, there was nothing, not a single opportunity. The landscape was harsh. I was about 28 years old at the time, and I looked like I was about 18 or 19. And so most of the people that I met with were around the same age as I am today, maybe a little bit older, and they were extremely guarded about their security programs. Most of them, during meetings, would essentially drop full bags of compliance acronyms on the table, most of them that I had never heard of before. And in fact, at the tail end of this 3-week experience, I was meeting with a company in Chicago, and they happened to ask if I knew what I later learned was called the Options Clearing Corporation. But they asked me, hey, do you know the OCC? And sort of being done with these meetings, I responded, yeah, you know me. And that basically resulted in them telling me, you can never possibly help me with any security initiative I have going on now or in the foreseeable future. To this day, I'm actually not sure why most of these companies took a sales call from me. They had never heard of my company before, other than the fact, and I know this happens because I've been on the other side before, occasionally people like to abuse new sales reps. And so I was subject to that for about 3 weeks. Now, at the end of all this, I essentially needed a drink. And so I called up a high school friend of mine. His name was Keith Garner. And at the time, he was a senior IT person at an organization known as the National Association of Realtors. Now, if you don't know what that association is, it's the largest business association in the world. It has over 1 million members and had over 1,000 smaller local associations within it. So my friend and I were enjoying a beer, and he happened to mention to me that his CIO just had a meeting with their entire team and said, we need to do something around security for our membership. Now, their members are people who are real estate agents, realtors, and then also they have relationships with organizations known as multiple listing services, or MLSs. So I said, hey, now put back on my sales hat and said, hey, do you think I can get a meeting with your CIO just to chat about security? So my friend's like, yeah, sure. Within 2 days, we were at a Thai restaurant. It was my friend and I and their CIO, and we started to talk about his security concerns, the things that he was looking to do, and talked about, and I learned a great deal about the real estate industry, how that entire world worked. I had no idea. Actually, I only had bought one house and spent 5 minutes with my realtor. But when we were chatting, he talked about the threats, the perceived threats he had to the various information that they had in their world, and also essentially the types of attacks that they were seeing against people like realtors and people like MLSs. So at the end of this, I ended up pitching him on the development of a program. It was sort of a hybrid education compliance program, and they bit. And they said, hey, can you draft up a statement of work? So I ran back to my office as quickly as I could. Actually, I think literally, I ran as quickly as I could back to my office and sat down and drafted up a statement of work that would outline the development of a compliance program for the National Association of Realtors. In the end, at the end of about 6 weeks, I delivered to them something that became known as the Realtor Secure Program, with a focus on agents and multiple listing services. Now, NAR is a massive organization. They have an annual conference every year. I think it's still at the Moscone Center. Literally rent out the entire thing. Very similar in size to like the RSA conference that most of us probably have been to before. And so they went and they launched the Realtor Secure Program in front of 20,000 people, which included press releases and also a whole panel discussion, which I participated in. Now, that all sounds great, but in fact, the program actually limped along for about 3 years. And only about 20 organizations ever went through the certification process at all. Most of them all multiple listing services. And then a few years later, the content was completely removed from the website. And if you Google search it for today, you're going to find a couple of press releases, and that's about it. And maybe some message boards where people were asking about the program. Now, as the author of the program, I can tell you this was just about as robust of anything else out there. I spent hours and hours researching, reading different frameworks, reading different programs, interviewed their constituents, people within their industry, interviewed folks within the entire organization, and we went round and round of edits. It was completely designed with process flow diagrams, easy to follow, essentially paint by number compliance for this population, because the population of realtors, these aren't technical folks. These are people many times have other jobs and they just happen to sell houses. And it was just completely easy to follow. Now, why did this program fail? Think about this. I started thinking about, why did this program fail? Well, about 6 months after we launched the program, I started to realize the mistakes that we made. And we had built this entire compliance program, targeted it at a population, thought it should run on its own, but there were some big mistakes. One, there were no publicly documented threats against this data at all. This program was designed to protect against data that no one was going after. The data within scope of the certification, I learned later on, was actually mostly in public records. So really hard to defend or protect data that's in public records. There had never been any organizations or any prosecutions of anybody who either failed to protect the data or actually attacked somebody and actually tried to steal the data. And then we found out that none of the realtors really cared about security at all. We happened to send a blast email out to 100,000 people and said, hey, are you interested in participating during the development? And we got 4 or 5 people who responded. We should have took that as a sign. A very small percentage of people actually cared about security. And then most of the MLS organizations, the service providers in this world, didn't see any marketing value at all. And in fact, if you think about how MLSs work, they typically operate in a region with almost no competition. And so them having the seal of approval really didn't make any sense, or it didn't really do anything for them. But I learned a great deal about this program through this process. And it was a bumpy road. It was a major failure, essentially, in the development of this standard. But it didn't discourage me from trying something again, should this opportunity arise. So my role as the first technical hire at TrustWave, I also was busy delivering penetration tests and instant response engagements. And in fact, around the same time that we were developing the Realtor Secure program, TrustWave became a visa assessor and also a visa qualified forensic investigation firm. Now, by early 2004, I had investigated about 35 or so data breach investigations. And all of those were tied to merchants who had their systems compromised and cardholder data was stolen, credit card data was stolen. Just being me, I always track and analyze almost everything in my world. Even from the first investigation, I had a spreadsheet where I would put the investigation and had all the attributes of what I was seeing across these investigations, the flaws that they had and the other issues I would see. And I started tracking those. And after I had about 35 of those, I started to see some interesting trends. The operating systems that were running these payment applications were never updated. Something would get installed on January 1st, 2000. No one ever touched these systems. They were never updated by the time someone went in to investigate the data breach. The administrator password on these systems were mostly blank, or they were either the same as the username. The systems ran AV, but the definitions typically expired many, many months ago, or sometimes years ago. And then the payment applications themselves stored the data that the criminals were going after in the clear on the hard drives of the systems. Or if they didn't, there was a debug feature. You could literally go into a setting and you check it off and it would log all the data for you. And then to make things worse, these things were plugged into the internet. And they had remote access, sometimes proprietary remote access tools. Sometimes it was PC Anywhere or things like VNC that were connected up with these systems. Now, with this problem at hand, I had a good trend of about 35 environments. It wasn't huge, but I saw this trend happening. Nearly everyone had the same problems. I started to think, is there a way to solve this problem? Is there something that we can do to make this better? And I started to think about this, and I started to ask questions around, what if there was some governing body in place that actually could focus on this population? Now, for the criminal groups, this was a perfect storm. It was essentially a perfect storm that was in place. Now, the perfect storm that existed is that all these systems were full of vulnerabilities, and the criminals were very hungry, and they can go after these environments over and over again. So when I think about this, what were the other contributing factors? Why did this population, now this was 35 systems, but in the world of the merchant world, there was not just 35 organizations, there were millions. Anywhere between 3 and 4 million organizations. And I started to think about, why would this be possible? Why is there an entire industry that's very, very lacking of security? So I started to dig deeper and started asking lots of questions. And what I learned was pretty interesting. The merchants did not have any technical expertise in place at all, and they relied heavily on third-party integrators. Now, the integrators were organizations that employed people with the ability to follow technical instructions. They can follow checklists to install these systems, but we're not actually that technical. They couldn't think outside the box at all. You give them a checklist, they can follow it just fine. If you spoke to the merchants and said, were the systems installed correctly? Yeah, absolutely. Did you run into problems? No, they ran. It was a great installation. And then the software manufacturers wrote pretty decent software. From a communication spec standpoint and from a functionality and UI UX standpoint, the merchants were really happy with those solutions. But they didn't see security as their responsibility at all. The integrators assumed that the merchants were taking care of security. And then, of course, the merchants assumed they were buying a secure system. So if you see the problem that was created here, you basically have nobody thinking that security was their responsibility, and it fell right between the middle of all of them. So I started to think, well, what if we actually did have a governing body? What if something actually existed that can actually put together a standard and apply some standards to this population and require the payment vendors to actually have the seal of approval before they can sell their products? And then, of course, what if the integrators themselves actually had to follow an installation guide that told them not only how to install this system correctly, but install it in a secure manner? And then, of course, they tore off a sheet when they were done with the installation and handed it to the merchant and said, I did my job, here are your responsibilities. One, you actually bought an approved system, but two, you have to do these things. You have to change the passwords. You have to update the AV definition, the antivirus definitions. There's things that you're responsible for. And I started to think, well, could something like this across a large population of 3 to 4 million companies have a measurable impact going on? Many companies were actually, which I had witnessed firsthand, when something like this was happening, they were actually going under. I remember one night sitting in a manager's office, imaging a payment system, and having the owner actually physically in tears that they hadn't made any money in about 18 months, and this data breach was actually going to put them out of business. And so I thought, well, hey, this sounds like a very unique opportunity for me to try to do something and actually learn from all the mistakes of the Realtor Secure program and actually try to change the world and make a big difference in the world. So in February 2004, I actually sat down and drafted something I called the Application Security Standard for Payment Systems. Now, due to my involvement with lots and lots of data breaches, I happen to have the ear of Visa 3 to 4 times a week. And I mentioned to them that I was working on something. Now, they became very interested and wanted to see a copy of that standard. I held back and I said, hey, I want to actually want to run some applications through this to actually see if what I'm thinking is applicable or actually is effective. And around the same time, I was at a conference. I actually happened to meet someone at a very, very large payment vendor, so a brand name that if I told you, everybody would know the name. The payment vendor themselves had said, hey, I have 3 applications. I have an extremely large merchant that won't get off my back about security. Can you actually review my applications and then go and write a letter to this merchant and tell them, hey, this stuff is secure? I said, well, one, I have to see if it's secure first before I agree to writing a letter, but I actually have another need as well. I actually wrote this standard, and I need to actually review a few applications. So I'll make a deal with you. I will actually review these applications, and I'll write the letter to your merchant if these things are actually secure, if you actually will follow up and meet the requirements that I put in place. And I'll actually do it for free. And I'll do it for free if you go hand in hand with me to Visa to actually show them this program. Well, the large payment vendor, so like this sounds like a win-win for me. I'm going to get a free engagement. You're going to write a letter for me, and I just have to go visit Visa and actually show them this program. They agreed. And so I told Visa about this, and they said, okay, well, let me know when you're ready. About 2 months later, we were actually on a flight out to Foster City, California, and met with Visa's security team. We showed them the results of the payment application assessments. We showed them the standard. We walked through the standard itself, and they go, hey, this looks great. Can I have a copy of it? So I handed them a copy of it, and they said, okay, well, we're going to review it, and we may actually include this in something we have now called the Cardholder Information Security Program. And then after this meeting, I heard nothing. I heard nothing back from them, actually for about 5 months, until one day, I remember specifically the email popping in. It was an invitation. It was an invitation to attend an event back in California for the launch of something they were calling the Payment Application Best Practices. And of course, the email, it included a copy of the Payment Application Best Practices. They thanked me for my contribution to it. I quickly opened it up, and it was about 95% the same of what I actually submitted to them. They invited me to this event, and at the event itself, they walked through the building, the background around why this program needed to exist. They talked about some attack statistics that they were seeing across the ecosystem, and then it was a walkthrough of the payment application best practices. Now, I remember being in the room when this was happening and visually seeing the crowd basically change and sort of organize into two camps. You had the very large vendors, the ones who were the brand name companies who wrote software for this ecosystem. They started to frown. And at the time, BlackBerrys were popular. I remember seeing some people start pecking out messages on their BlackBerry as they're learning more and more about this because they saw dollar signs. And they didn't see dollar signs in the form of they were going to make lots of money. They saw this as this standard was going to cost them a lot of money. They had lots of applications. They were not very fast moving. They were not very nimble. And for them to go through this certification, it was going to be a very big impact to their business. And at the same time, we had folks that had all smiles on their face. And what I later learned, that these individuals were part of more of like the mid-market for this industry. And these individuals actually did see dollar signs. They saw this as an opportunity. They saw this as an opportunity for them to actually move faster than their competition, get the seal of approval on their application, and then actually create an advantage for them in the marketplace. So at the end of this meeting, they had a social hour at the end of it, I walked away with about 40 business cards in my hand, with most of those organizations wanting to get started as soon as possible. Some of them said, hey, can we get started on Monday? I think this was like a Thursday that the meeting was. And I had to go back to my business and try to figure out how we're going to actually service all of these organizations that are looking for this certification. Now, we'll go back to the question of, you have this large population, and you have this new compliance standard that's applied to this large population, and it raises a question, did the development and rollout of this standard have a measurable impact on the criminal groups that were targeting this population? Now, I know for a fact that it did, but not in the way you might expect. You see, this merchant population was extremely large, they were extremely slow moving, and most of them actually needed about 10 to 15 years. They needed to get about 10 to 15 years out of their payment systems. That's how they modeled their business. They spent $25,000 on a payment system, and if you're running a restaurant, spending another $25,000 the next year was not in the budget. And because of that, at first, many of the payment vendors tried to charge them for the secure version of the payment systems. And they quickly learned that that was not going to work, and so they started offering it part of the support agreements. Eventually, most organizations started to comply, and they started to upgrade their systems. And by 2008, this program was adopted as a global standard called the Payment Application Best Practices. Payment Application Best Practice was adopted as a global standard called the Payment Application Data Security Standard. And around the same time, I started to see some data breaches that were pretty concerning. And it started to give some signs that this program may not be as effective as we thought it was going to be. So this was rather confusing. How could this be possible? Shouldn't a standard itself have actually made the world better? Shouldn't this have actually cause the data breaches to slow down. But in fact, we actually saw these accelerating. The team that I was running at the time, where Tom Brennan was working as well, or he and I worked together. At first, we had about 40 data breaches we investigated in the first year. The next year, we investigated about 80. By the time this was happening, there was over 200 that we were investigating, and it kept accelerating. By the time I left that organization, we were investigating over 500 data breaches, specifically in this population on an annual basis. So, what was happening? Well, I saw the signs of this program not doing such a great job around that same time, but we ran across a merchant where the facts of the investigation didn't add up. Something was off. The target system was old, that was compromised. It was not compliant, and had easily exploitable known vulnerabilities. Shouldn't be a surprise. That's sort of what we saw before. The systems also didn't remotely comply with the standards. They were missing things like AV and had clear text data on the hard drive. Again, shouldn't have been a surprise. We saw this all the time. But this is where things went a little sideways. The attacker utilized an unknown vulnerability to get into the system. They deployed custom malware onto the system, and then was harvesting cardholder data out of memory. Sort of strange. Like, they didn't need to do that. Why were they doing that? If this would have been an isolated incident, we probably would have wrote it off as just sort of an anomaly. But our phone started to ring after this case. We got 5 phone calls, we got 10. We ended up with about 40 cases that were all using the same vendor brand of payment system, and all were compromised in the same method. Now, some of the systems were very old, like the one we saw, but some of them were actually brand new. These were compliant systems. These were compliant systems that should have been able to thwart the attackers that were targeting this world, but they weren't. And what we learned from this, and sort of doing, the only logical explanation, was that this attacker group read the standard. They knew what the rules were that they were going up against. They actually went and obtained a compliant version of the payment application. They installed it in their hacker layer and started to go to town trying to find vulnerabilities. And what we learned from this is they actually found an unknown vulnerability in the proprietary remote access system that was used on this application. They also assumed there was going to be AV running on it because the rules said there were supposed to be AV. So they wrote some custom malware to avoid the AV detection. And then they also assumed that the cardholder data was going to be encrypted on the system. Well, if the cardholder is encrypted on the system, we want to get it some way. So the attackers wrote a memory dumper and actually dumped that data out of memory and parsed it and extracted the data for exfiltration. Now, they didn't stop there. They actually wrote a tool and they used it to scan the internet. We started to see signs of this. We deployed some honeypots at the time and started to see some signs of a tool scanning and trying to hit these systems. So they were going to town. This was like shooting fish in a barrel for them. They just scanned the internet, they'd find a system, automatically get on and start pulling data from these environments. Now, I learned a lot about this as well, and this was another lesson in sort of the world of standards and compliance. And what I learned here is that if a security standard does not take into account a motivated and persistent adversary, it is doomed to fail the day after it is released. Now, it wasn't until a few years ago, now I sort of left that industry and have been doing some other things, but it wasn't until just a couple of years ago where I started to think about how does this fit and how does this apply to other industries? We're all facing various security standards, and I came up with something that I call the standard dilemma. Now, in the standard dilemma, you start with a standard. You develop a standard. Maybe a whole bunch of people get together and they write that standard. It takes some time, maybe a year, maybe more. But once it's released, the revision cycle is not going to be very quickly, and it's not going to keep up with the threats. And sometimes it's met with political barriers as well. Many organizations have lots of constituents, lots of people that have their hands in the pie. And some of them are just there to make sure that the standard doesn't evolve. Because when it evolves, it costs their business lots and lots of money. The organizations that are working to obtain the security standard will often just implement the minimum requirements. That's it. They handed a standard. Why exceed those? I'm just going to do what's minimally there, what's minimally required. Now, it gets even worse. Many organizations will implement the minimum the interpretation of the standard, which isn't even up to par with what the authors actually intended for that standard. Now you have the auditors that come in. The auditors will be managed. They won't be given free reign of the entire organization. You're going to say, meet with Bob and not Tom. You're going to say, look over here and not over there. And they're going to be managed through this process. And then the overall population will actually improve from a security standpoint. You take a population that's completely unregulated, has no governing body over them, and it's just a wild west. They're missing all the basic security controls, and you give them something to grasp onto, they are going to make improvements. And they will make measurable improvements, but then they'll plateau. And when they plateau, that's where the problem sets in, because the adversaries are not just going to stop. They're not just going to say, well, I can't get in anymore, so I'm going to move on to someplace else, especially if it's a large industry. They're actually going to innovate, and they're going to find ways to circumvent the controls and then have a target population that is left with a false sense of security at an outdated reference point. Now, this leads me to what I'm doing at Uptake. Now, at Uptake, I've been given a unique opportunity to build a security program from the ground up. And I'm sure most of you don't know who Uptake is. It's about a 2-year-old company. It's a startup out of Chicago. We're a predictive analytics, predictive insight company out of Chicago. But I'm going to give you a little glimpse of things that we have going on. Now, in the world that all of us live in, we have mobile devices, and most of the technology we interact with is probably either on our hand, or it's in our wrist, or it's on our lap. This technology often has problems. It falls apart, it breaks down, you drop your phone on the floor or in the toilet, and it breaks. But the impact to you, and impact to the world around you, is not that great. If you break your iPhone, you go to the Apple store and you get a new one for like $99. Now, when you're walking around the streets of New York City, you're going to see construction equipment. You're going to see trains. You're going to see buses. And if you look to the sky, you're going to see airplanes or helicopters. Now, these vehicles are developed by some of the largest companies on the planet. Some of these companies have been around for 100+ years. And with all of their capabilities and with all of their technology and all of their advancements and the progress they've had, these things still fail. And when these things fail, there's real measurable impact on the world around us. Not just, there's economic impact. There's human impact to when these things fail. Now at Uptake, our company has built a platform. It's an analytics platform that specifically looks and provides operators of these vehicles the ability to predict failures, to be able to improve efficiency of these machines and of these devices, and also avoid safety issues. Now, how we do it is we actually take thousands of sensors that are on these vehicles today, that exist today. We ingest all of that data. We perform behavior analytics, behavior modeling of this data. We do machine learning, and then we present the results in industry-specific interfaces that the operators of these vehicles can use, can be alerted when there's going to be a failure, and then they can take action and avoid the issues before they happen. Now, if all of this sounds like Minority Report for something that can ruin your morning commute, and in essence it is, and I've actually seen it work. Now, as the CISO of this organization, my responsibilities include product security and our platform security, corporate security, and also physical security. Now, realizing the massive responsibility that Uptake has and Uptake will have in the world, I am passionate about doing the security the right way at the right time during our evolution. Now, while I'm not going to provide a blueprint of everything I'm doing at Uptake, what I am going to provide is some of the best practices, some of the things that I've gleaned through my experiences that push beyond some of the basics and push beyond some of the things that compliance standards and things will tell you to do. Now, the first one that I have here may come as a surprise. And this probably goes against what I've been talking about for the last 40 minutes or so. What I'm telling you is to hire the best possible risk and compliance team you can afford. Now, why am I saying that? Well, it's very common for when an auditor comes knocking, or an audit is going to take place, for your entire security team, for lots and lots of people to get pulled away from their day jobs, for people to sit and try to study up and try to plan and prepare for that auditor. That if you're doing that, and you probably have experienced this in your world. If you are doing that, it's your entire program is suffering every single time this happens. Now, if you're at a company that actually has auditors that come in every other month to come look at something, and your security team is bogged down with the preparation and the participation in these audits, that's a real problem. So instead, your team should be chartered at being able to comply and pass and speak to an auditor and be involved in an audit and assessment at a moment's notice. If someone knocks on your door on Monday morning, come on in. Let's sit down and chat. Here's all the evidence we've been gathering against whatever compliance standard that you can possibly toss at us. The next one is build your own internal red team capability. Now, if you within your organization, in my role, I have people who tell me I don't know what I'm doing in my organization. It's their job. Their sole job is to say, you're doing a bad job. This security program is not adequate. And their job is to actually go off and technically prove it to me. So if you don't have something like that within your business, then you're missing out on the opportunity for constant improvement. Now, this is not something that you just do once a year. It's not like the third-party pen testers come in and they show you how they hacked your environment. This is continuously. And that team is actually given independence within my organization to do whatever they want. They can hack any aspect of our business at any given time. Because we know that if they're not doing it, and we're not learning from that, eventually someone else is going to do it, and it's going to come in the form of a compromise. The other one is hunting for adversaries continuously. Now, you probably have a lot of technology in place. Endpoint technology, you probably have SIMs, you probably have intrusion detection systems, you probably have MSS providers that actually come in and actually manage and monitor your environment. Well, what I'm telling you is that you should trust none of that. You should use it as a backstop. It should give you alerts, and hopefully it's effective enough to give you some alerts now and then. But what you should have folks that continuously look for problems, look for indicators of compromise inside your environment. Now, again, like our red team, this team that I have has free reign as well. They have the ability to think like attackers, navigate our environment and say, I think something, if I was an attacker, I would go after this system. Or I know this system was just deployed in our environment. I'm going to go check it out. And they actually have the ability to do that, and they do it on a continuous basis. The next one is focus on your endpoints holistically. Now, what I'm talking about here is not the endpoint technology you install on your systems. It's about the human endpoints that you have. Now, we often talk about, humans choose really, really bad passwords. Employees choose bad passwords. And that they inadvertently send documents to people when they shouldn't. And all the things that typically your programs haven't been designed to control. Well, what I'm saying here is that give your humans the ability to make the right security decisions. Give them things like password managers to basically eliminate password reuse from your environment. Let them choose good passwords. Also saying is, give them tools so they can securely share documents internally and externally, track access to them, and revoke access if they need to. And then finally, develop a greater purpose for protecting your critical assets and your critical data. Now, I truly believe that policies and procedures and technology and the right security people will make a pretty good security program. But I've seen way too many compromised organizations, some of the largest in the world, that have been compromised, where they had all of that in place. And they were well funded, and they basically should have had they should, on paper, they look like they had the perfect program. But what I've learned it comes down to are the people within your organization who don't have security in their title. The people who are not part of your IT security organization. So if you can build a culture where each and every employee realize the impact that their security decisions have on your company, on your partners, on the economy, and even on the greater world around them, your program will be magnitudes more effective than those who don't. So in search of how to do this at Uptake, and try to instill this within the employees at Uptake, I actually looked around to see if there was anything like this in the world that I was navigating. So in our industry, does anything like this exist? And I happened upon something that was written and created, actually, Jeff Williams is in the room, but Jeff Williams and Josh Corman actually created something called Rugged Software, a program called Rugged Software. And part of that program was something called the Rugged Manifesto. Now, I read that manifesto a couple of times, placed it on my desk, and thought, this is pretty good. This is something that I can really use within my company. I read it again and thought, maybe it's a little long. Maybe some of the word choice and some of the things weren't 100% applicable to my organization. So I took it and I reassembled it a little bit. I shortened it up, swapped out some words, and shared it with the leadership team, with my peers at Uptake. They thought it was great. They thought it was something that would be really effective. And with the support of our CEO, Brad Keywell, at All Hands, I actually presented it to the entire company. And not only presented it to the entire company, but we printed out 4x6 branded cards that has our security manifesto on it and handed it out to every employee at that time. And now every single employee who goes through a new hire training hears about it and actually is given one. And when I walk around the halls at Uptake, I actually see that manifesto pinned to many people's desks, or I see it sitting on their desk, or pinned to a bulletin board. So I'm going to share it with you right now. It starts out with, I recognize that software has become a foundation of our modern world. I recognize the awesome responsibility that comes with this foundational role. I recognize my creations will be used in ways I cannot anticipate, in ways they were not designed, and for longer than ever intended. I recognize my creations will be attacked by talented and persistent adversaries who threaten our physical, economic, and national security. I recognize these things and I choose to be secure. I'm secure because I refuse to be a source of vulnerability or weakness. I am secure not because it is easy, but because it is necessary, and I am up for the challenge. Now, no matter what type of organization you're in, whether it's a manufacturing company, a financial institution, or a retailer, when you work to instill this in your culture, within your population of your end users, what I've learned, and through my experiences, that it really matters, but what's most important is that it is those moments between the facility inspections and the security audits, when no one is looking, when the security team isn't around, that really matter most. Thanks for listening.